So welcome, everyone. My name is Melanca Clark, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you all to the Michigan Roundtable on Safety and Justice. I'm the president and CEO of the Hudson-Webber Foundation, which is a foundation based here in Detroit, a grant-making foundation that has origins dating back in this city to 1939, when we were established with major contributions from the Webber family and the J.L. Hudson department store, which I know you are all familiar with. Our mission is to improve the quality of life in Detroit, and we are specifically interested in helping ensure that Detroit, that the recovery that's happening here in Detroit is inclusive and enduring. And so as part of that mission, we seek to identify and support strategies that intentionally connect people and communities to opportunity and address structural barriers that impede progress. And from our vantage point in Detroit, a significant barrier to opportunity for our community is criminal justice involvement. So I'll share that before coming to the Hudson-Webber Foundation, I spent 6 years in the federal government. I worked on various aspects of criminal justice policy, and from that work, I was well aware of research pertaining to the diminishing public safety returns of tough-on-crime policies that have led to an explosion in incarceration, the tremendous strain on state and federal budgets as spending on incarceration has crowded out other priorities, and the persistent racial disparities across multiple decision points that impact the public's perception of the fairness of the criminal justice system. What's been reinforced for me now that I'm in the foundation, where we're pursuing a shared prosperity agenda, is really the economic justice piece of that, or the profound impact that criminal justice involvement has on economic mobility. So we know in Detroit that a disproportionately high number of our residents have criminal justice contact. Most of those Detroiters either are or they are returning to this community. And when they return, their earning prospects are diminished, pathways to opportunity are thwarted. This has a multi-generational effect, which in turn gets us to more crime, more poverty, and the cycle continues. So this is not just an issue here in Detroit. I'd note, and this was stunning to me, but that over 3 million Michiganders have some type of criminal record. To be sure, there's been significant progress. Incarceration rates in this state have diminished significantly from the highs of the mid-2000s. Just today, you may have seen in the news this morning that Governor Snyder has just signed an executive order banning the box on hiring applications for state departments and agencies, which is good news. So we need to continue to move the needle by identifying policy reforms that are informed by evidence, that are equitable, that promote public safety and improve community well-being. And that is the work at hand. So our foundation is hosting this convening in partnership with our partners, the Mackinac Center and the Michigan League on Public Policy, to help stakeholders take stock of where we've been and to see how much further we can go. So we're so grateful to have all of you here. We have members of the judiciary, law enforcement, representatives from state agencies, returning citizens, advocates, elected officials, funders, all that bring a diverse set of perspectives from different vantage points, both within and outside of the system. So if you look at our agenda, you can see this is a little bit different, I think, than a typical conference. We're actually not calling this a conference, it's a roundtable. We're light on panels, and we're heavy on having all of you here roll up your sleeves and provide input on the key issues that are impacting us in the state with regards to criminal justice. We want to know what common challenges you see, what the work is that's underway. But perhaps most significantly, we're asking you to identify concrete action items that can advance the field. And I'd also offer, we've got a set of statewide elections in front of us, and I think a really important window of opportunity to elevate these issues and to, for the incoming administration, and to offer the action items that might be generated here at this convening as a roadmap to effective and equitable solutions for our state. So before handing it over and introducing one of our co-hosts, Gilda Jacobs, I want to say we are live streaming right now this portion of our convening. So hello to folks out on the internet. We do have a social media hashtag, which is hashtag MIJustice. that you can use to follow. And so now let me introduce Gilda. Gilda has served as the president and CEO of the Michigan League for Public Policy since 2011. This follows a 30-year career in public service, which includes her time in the state Senate for 8 years after serving 2 terms in the Michigan House of Representatives, where she made history as the first woman leader on the floor in either chamber of the legislature. I'm so pleased to welcome Gilda to the stage. Thank you.
Good morning. So I want to thank Melanca for the introduction and for the Hudson-Webber Foundation's leadership in generating this discussion and underwriting these events. It's actually been two days of incredible conversation. We're really proud from the League to be here. I love looking around, seeing this incredibly diverse room filled with people from all different walks of life and perspectives and geographical areas, and as well as politically. You really don't have to look much further than our agenda for opening remarks to see that the conversation that we're having today is so important for all of us who have a stake in criminal justice issues. Today you have me representing the Michigan League for Public Policy sharing the stage and the list of hosts with Kahryn Riley and the Mackinac Center. And in a few minutes you'll have Democratic Lieutenant Governor candidate Garland Gilchrist, followed by Attorney General candidate and Republican House Leader Tom Leonard. So the League and the Mackinac Center and others are here today. I would say maybe we're sort of unusual bedfellows, but our bipartisan partnership and agreement on the need for criminal justice reforms speaks to just how important these issues are in Michigan. And while the reasons behind our support may vary a bit, I'm glad we're all here for the good of our people, our communities, our economy, and our state. So if you go back into the history of the Michigan League for Public Policy, we've been kicking around for over 100 years, and we trace our roots back to 1912 when we were called the Michigan Conference of Charities and Corrections. And while child labor laws and some of the issues that we faced back then have improved, and some of those issues have actually even become obsolete, other challenges facing Michigan residents, especially those in the criminal justice system, are just as pressing today as they were back then. As an organization focused on economic security and racial equity for all, criminal justice reforms touch nearly every aspect of our work. And today we'll be discussing how to improve data collection and reporting, community policing practices, current policies that make poverty and an inability to pay costs and fines and add crime. We're going to talk about alternatives to incarceration and ways to shorten prison stays. And finally, take a look at post-incarceration barriers that make it so difficult for returning citizens to avoid recidivism and reacclimate to society. I am really looking forward to having this important conversation with all of you and actually bringing in all these varied perspectives on how to best tackle these topics. As Melanca said, I served in the legislature for 12 years before coming to the League. I always say I'm a recovering state senator, and I've been on both sides of the policy debate. But when I was a lawmaker, one of the most valuable things that I learned is the ability to know what you don't know. To be honest, I wish people had educated me more on these issues when I was in office. In fact, I got put on a committee, on the corrections committee, because I was married to a lawyer. That's not the best reason that you ought to be put on a committee. On important public policies, it's vital to listen to the experts in their respective fields and the individuals who are most directly affected by them. It's essential to know that policy problems affect different people in different districts in different ways, but that there are improvements that can be made to benefit everyone across the board. And those are the kinds of things that we hope to gather today. The issues that affect every legislator's district are the things that we're going to talk about, and all of us here have a stake in our state, and tackling criminal justice reforms is one of the sweeping ways to make those improvements. So now is the time to do it. We appreciate everybody being here. I want to turn the podium over to Kahryn Riley, who is the Director of Criminal Justice Policy for the Mackinac Center. And again, thank you so much for all coming and spending a good part of your day with us today.
Yes, welcome. Thank you so much for being here. I'm very excited for the day that we're going to have today. I want to echo the warm welcome that my partners gave to everyone in the room. I think it's so important that we're gathering to discuss these important issues. We've kind of been over what we'll be doing today and why it's important. I'd just like to say a couple of words about the Mackinac Center and why we're here. The Mackinac Center is a state-based, nonpartisan research institute. We're based up in Midland. We've been active for about 30 years. And our goal is to advance individual liberty and prosperity and fight government overreach. I've been with the center for about 4 years, and I was lucky enough to launch a full-time criminal justice initiative about 2 years ago. And this new issue area brought us into closer partnership, not only with our colleagues here in the state, but with a growing movement of free market think tanks nationwide, which you'll hear more about during our plenary luncheon with Mark Holden today. A growing movement of free market think tanks nationwide that have engaged on this issue area because they're deeply concerned with checking the most fearsome power of government, which is, of course, the ability to deprive an individual of their liberty. I have heard some of our non-traditional allies say that the best way to persuade a free market advocate on criminal justice issues is to emphasize the financial burden that bad justice places on society. And of course, that's a concern. But of course, we're not only here because that's the concern. We're here because that also indicates something about the way that we are operating a core function of our government. And I think, the underlying conversation that we want to have here today is, will this core function, can we make it function in a way that better reflects all of our basic shared values? And so for that reason, it feels very right to be working with you all here today across ideological lines and professions to ensure that we really are achieving those outcomes that we all have in common. So again, thank you so much for joining us today. It's going to be a fantastic day, and I look forward to working with and talking to more of you throughout the day. Thank you.
So as Gilda mentioned, we have some special guests with us here today who are not on your agenda. And so it's my great pleasure to first introduce Garland Gilchrist, who is the Democratic candidate for Lieutenant Governor. I do want to say, and then I will come back, of course, to introduce Representative Leonard. I just wanted to let you know, to give some context to the guests that we have today, that we did reach out and invite candidates from both parties to address our convening today and yesterday when we had a similar conversation on juvenile justice issues. And to be very clear, we are not endorsing any candidate. We have not been asked as hosts or as participants to endorse any particular candidate. I just wanted to make sure that was clear. So Garland Gilchrist, of course, is the Democratic candidate for Lieutenant Governor of Michigan. I will share that since February, he's served as founding director of the University of Michigan Center for Social Media Responsibility and as a former director of innovation and emerging technology for the city of Detroit. Garland grew up in Detroit's East Side and lives in the city's Corktown neighborhood. Thank you, Garland. Welcome.
Hi, good morning, everybody. Again, my name is Garland Gilchrist. I'm really happy to be here at this important conversation. When I think about safety and criminal justice reform, and really what we're talking about how do we recognize people's humanity? No matter what the context is and what the situation is, how do we recognize and empower people to be human beings and to be their full selves and be present in society? That's a value that I believe we all can share. It's a value that I believe brings us all together here in this room and also connects all of the work we do. I'm excited because this conversation is important. There's so many people, not only in the city of Detroit, but across the state of Michigan, who have had contact with the criminal justice system. And they deserve, it's not just about what we need, but what we deserve as human beings, to have policymakers at every level of government who recognize their humanity and will design policies to deal with these situations in context. So I'm actually happy that banning the box is moving forward in the state of Michigan. It's something that my running mate, Gretchen Whitmer, who is running for governor, also is very committed to ensuring that we remove, we're not removing the idea of background checks. What we're saying is building a relationship with a person first is important during the interview process when someone's looking to get work. We want to remove barriers to people participating in society in general. One of the other things that I'm really excited about is there are some really innovative programs happening in different parts of the state of Michigan that are creating enabling services and opportunities for returning citizens, starting while they are incarcerated, but supporting them once they get home to make sure that people are entering back into life and can be the full human beings that they are. There are programs like the Trading Places program, which is this amazing partnership between the laborers union in Michigan and the Michigan Department of Corrections, which is giving people access to training while they are incarcerated for skilled trades so they can come out and be connected to jobs through partnership with employers on the western side of the state. Programs like the Hard Hats to Handcuffs program in Escanaba, Michigan. These are programs we want to invest in further, and that Gretchen and I are looking forward to prioritizing to make sure that, again, just people's full opportunity and humanity is recognized. We also want to make sure that people's right to quality defense, for quality representation, is actually recognized and supported. We want to make sure there are good standards for that in the state of Michigan. It's something we've not seen on a consistent basis, but indigent defense matters because how much money you have in your pocket should not be an indicator of the rights you will be able to exercise as a Michigander. And we will fight to make sure that that is true, and we are ready to work alongside any other leaders, lawmakers, citizens to make that happen. So these are priority issues for me. You know, my career before I came back home and worked in city government was working in justice movements, racial justice, economic justice, social justice in general. And so I really appreciate making the connection between economic justice and criminal justice reform, between economic justice, criminal justice, and racial justice reforms, because we've seen how this set of issues cuts across everything else that we face. But if we're able to recognize our shared humanity, if we're able to have policies that are grounded in that humanity, we can ensure that everyone has the right and access to a future that is prosperous in the state of Michigan. And that's what Gretchen and Whitmer and I would like to enable in the state of Michigan with your help. So thank you so much for having me here today, and I'm looking forward to working with all of you as partners to reform our criminal justice system for the better here in Michigan. Thank you.
Thank you. So now I have the pleasure of introducing Representative Tom Leonard. Representative Leonard represents the residents of Clinton and Gratiot County. He is the Speaker of the House, and prior to being a state representative, he served as Assistant Attorney General for the state of Michigan and was also, prior to that, a prosecutor for Genesee County, where he was assigned to the Special Crimes Division. Representative Leonard and his family live in DeWitt Township. Thank you. Welcome, Representative Leonard.
Well, good morning, and thank you all so very much for having me. It's an incredible honor and blessing to be here this morning. And there's so much we can talk about as it relates to criminal justice reform, things we have done over the past few years and things that we need to do. But what I want to do is I want to tell everybody a quick story and talk about something that's near and dear to my heart, because I truly believe it's one of the strong linchpins if we're ever going to get serious about criminal justice reform in the state of Michigan. But my first job out of law school, I had the opportunity to clerk for the probate judge in Genesee County. Her name is Jenny Barkey, and I don't know if anybody knows Jenny Barkey. I know at least one person here does, my good friend Steve Mays, but she's quite a character, and she's a doer, and she likes to get things done. And shortly after clerking for her, we had a situation where over the weekend, one of the local defense attorneys, who was a pillar in the community, he had been practicing for over 20 years, a very good individual. We didn't know he was suffering from mental illness. And over the weekend, that particular weekend, some things happened. He found himself, he was arrested. And she came in that following Monday. And to this day, even with me being Speaker of the House, she still calls me Kid. If I were to pick up the phone, she'd call me Kid right now. She said, Kid, she said, this is not the kind of guy that needs to be in jail. There has to be an alternative for somebody like him. And she said, I've got this idea. I don't know how it's going to work. She said, but I want to start a mental health court here in the state of Michigan. Several weeks went by. She was working with all the stakeholders in Genesee County, and a couple months later, she put together and she had her first mental health court hearing. I'll be the first to tell you, I sat there as a young clerk for about an hour, hour and a half as these first 7 or 8 individuals came in and were the first participants of her mental health court. I walked back to her chamber afterwards and I said, Judge, this will never work. There's absolutely nothing you can do to help these individuals. I was her absolute biggest naysayer. And as the weeks went by, not only did she begin to prove me wrong, but most importantly, the people that were in her mental health court began to prove me wrong. And what I saw is I was sitting there week in and week out, and I don't claim to be a psychiatrist, I don't claim to be a psychologist, but one thing I learned sitting there week in and week out, when you take somebody that suffers from mental illness, they are a much different person when they are on their medication versus when they are off. And when I first got to the legislature, we did a great job expanding mental health courts in the state of Michigan, and as I started to look at and study this issue and the financial burden that it has on our state, when you look at our criminal justice system, we spend about $38,000 per year per inmate. But what we don't talk about are these two statistics right here. And that is 20 to 25% of our prison population suffers from some type of mental illness. And when they do, the cost of that inmate goes from about $38,000 a year to well over $100,000 per year. That's a lot of money that we are spending on individuals to incarcerate who probably shouldn't be there. But there was nothing in place to get them the help they needed before they found themselves in prison, costing us over $100,000 per year. So when I became Speaker of the House, I walked out in front of the media, and my press secretary, he said, be prepared. He said, they're going to ask you what your top priorities are. And one of the priorities that I told them, one of my top 3 priorities was addressing our broken mental health system. I said I didn't know where to start. I didn't know what the silver bullet was, but I knew we had to start the conversation. We had to get going on this. And within several months, I appointed a bipartisan task force. I believe it was 7 Republicans, 7 Democrats. They traveled the state. They met with stakeholders, probably many of you in this room, local CMHs, the law enforcement community, the defense bar. They toured some prisons, coming up with these ideas, a comprehensive report of things that we could do to help those that are mentally ill. And I should back up just a moment. I remember calling Judge Barkey when I had this idea, and I was talking to her about putting this together, and I'll never forget when she said to me, she said, "Kid," she said, "mental health courts are great, but why do we have to let it get to a place where we actually let them commit a crime before we start getting them the help they need?" And that was the crux, and that was the purpose of us putting together this task force. And just before December, they put together a comprehensive list. I believe there's about 85 or 86 action items on that list. I'll be frank, and I'll tell you, we've probably got hundreds more to put together that we've got to get accomplished. But we've gotten to work, and we've gotten a lot of great things done on that. And what I can tell you is this. I've traveled the state. I've spoken to a lot of our prosecutors. I've spoken to prosecutors in urban areas. If you're talking to a prosecutor in Wayne County, Genesee County, Saginaw County, if you're talking to a prosecutor in Pontiac, many of those prosecutors are most focused on their most recent homicide or carjacking or violent crime. If you go to a rural area and you talk to the Schoolcraft County prosecutor in the Upper Peninsula, he's the only prosecutor there. He doesn't have an assistant. Point being is many of these local county prosecutors, they can't focus on these treatment courts the way that they need to, whether it be mental health, whether it be drug, whether it be sobriety, veterans courts, you name it. One thing that our Attorney General's office has to do as head of the state's largest law firm, we've got to make certain that we're doing a better job collaborating with these local prosecutors' offices to ensure that all of these treatment courts are functioning and we're getting these folks the help that they need. So that's certainly one thing that I want to focus on. This is going to be, continue to be a top priority for me as we go forward. You can count on that. And then one thing in closing, I'm going to pivot just a little bit, but I am so proud of what we were able to get done. I know most of you in this room probably know about it, but one of the things that that I witnessed and I saw as a prosecutor week in and week out as I was doing misdemeanor pre-trials in places like Flint and Mount Morris were the hundreds of people that were showing up to court and they were being burdened and buried by these ridiculous driver responsibility fees. And over the past year, I started looking into this, and I found out, I could not believe it. I was shocked by the fact that 350,000 of our residents currently cannot drive because of these fees. I believe it's 80,000 of them live right here in the city of Detroit. Many of them that owe $15,000, $16,000, $17,000 in these fees. And this has been nothing but a tax and a burden, particularly on the working poor. Because if you take somebody that makes a good salary and they've got benefits and they have a $1,000 fee to pay, they're going to pay it to keep their driver's license. But if you take the poor single mother that's making $12, $13 an hour in the city of Detroit and you send her a $1,000 bill, she can't keep a driver's license. And when we started talking about skilled trades with the governor and he wanted to implement his Marshall Plan, I was very clear that if this is something we were going to get done, first we were going to start with the basics. And we were going to make certain that these 350,000 people could show up to the Secretary of State's office and finally get a driver's license and go out and get a job. And I am proud of the fact that on October 1st, these 350,000 citizens will be able to go to the Secretary of State's office. They won't have to pay a dime. And many of them, for the first time in years, will be able to drive legally. And I think that's a message that we need to get out to everybody, because that is a big deal for the state, especially when we have a talent gap here and we have tens of thousands of jobs that we need to fill. So with that, again, I just want to thank everybody here in this room for all that you do. Certainly this is a very serious and big issue and topic. We need to reduce the prison costs here in the state, but as was being mentioned earlier, it's also the right thing to do for our people and our citizens. And I look forward to working with each of you in the years ahead to ensure that we do that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much to both our candidates for spending this time with us. And I will commit to say that at the close of this convening and after yesterday's conversation, we will have a report that summarizes the work that we have done here, and are glad to be sharing it with both of you and other candidates. So let us move into the next part of our presentation. And I want to introduce to you Amanda Alexander, who is the founding executive director of the Detroit Justice Center, and Sheryl Kubiak, who is the dean and professor of the Wayne State University School of Social Work. And I am so grateful that they're going to be helping us today with the very ambitious task of providing an overview or a framework of the topics that we're going to be discussing in depth in the small group sessions later this afternoon. We've given them a very little amount of time to go through a very substantial amount of information, so we do appreciate the task. And I didn't have a chance to tell you guys, but the clicker is up here, so we can advance the slides that way. Thank you.
This is the clicker? Okay. Good morning. Good morning. Listen, tag me if I'm too long. Good morning, everyone. I'm really happy to be here. This is a cornerstone of my life for the last 30 years, so it's very nice to see some very familiar faces in the audience and make some new friends. So I'm going to start today with our first issue, and the first issue is data collection and reporting. And when we ask why would this be important to criminal justice reform, well, I think that we have to think about what are the goals of our criminal justice system, and how do we know when we've met them? We're in an era of evidence-based practice. We talk and we hear all the time. A lot of our funding priorities depend on evidence-based practices and knowledge that things are working. In the criminal justice system, we don't know if we're succeeding or failing if we can't use data to measure. And there are many challenges to getting that measurement within the state of Michigan. And those of you who know me and have worked with me know that I'm very passionate about this. But there's one of the barriers that we have is in how do we define, right? How do we define what is success and what is failure? So, for example, I'm a member of the Criminal Justice Policy Commission, and we spent, 3 months defining recidivism? And recidivism is thrown around all the time as a measure or a mark of what's successful. But when you think about how to measure it, are you measuring time to arrest, conviction, return to prison, jail, probation violation? There's many facets of what can constitute as recidivism. Similarly, success. If employment is a successful outcome of a work program, then are we talking about over-the-table employment, full-time employment, part-time employment, seasonal employment? So you get into really needing to understand what are you looking for and how is it defined. So that's the first issue. The second is that there are multiple sources and levels of data. So at the state level, we have Michigan Department of Corrections, which Jeff Anderson and Kyle Kaminsky know very well, is a really good data set, and it really allows us to look at who returns to prison and the length of time that they're in prison. But if you wanted to see if someone released from prison ended up in a jail, you can't do that because there's no integration between the county jails, which I think there's 81 in our 83 counties, between those county jails and our State Department of Corrections data. So again, back to our definition of recidivism, if we want to include jail as a point of recidivism, we can't easily do that. Similarly, the court data, we've gone through and, well, we haven't, SCAO has gone through and integrated most of the courts around the state, but we have courts on multiple levels. And knowing what a misdemeanor offense is in terms of recidivism is nearly impossible to do in the state right now. We also have a lack of integration between all of this data, so that if someone is going from a county jail to another county and they end up in jail, there's no way for those jails to communicate that information unless they know the face of that person. But then the expense of integrating, and particularly jail data, if we could integrate the jail data across the state and have it accessible, that would be a big opportunity for all of us. But integrating those 81 different management information systems and their platforms is both an expense and they're county generated. And so there's no overarching mandate from the state that says, yes, we will integrate. Finally, the access to data. Who has access to it? Is it just legislators? Is it just the governor? Or is it open to complete public access or a limited access in terms of research? And what are the confidentiality issues? So these are all issues that need to be worked out before we can move further on some of the good data analysis that we need to do to move reform forward. Second, I'm going to talk about community policing. And we all know that I think that being a law enforcement officer is a very difficult job, not a job that I would like. It's very stressful. You're the first responder. There's a lot of danger that they encounter on a daily basis. So as difficult as that is, it's also very difficult to be a member in a community where you do not feel protected by the police. And so community policing is an operational philosophy. It's a philosophy of how to police. And it enhances the connections within the community so that we can increase resilience to crime and public safety through this collaborative engagement between individuals in the community. Community policing encompasses many different models. So it's not just one model, it's not just one size fits all for communities. But there are three main components to it. You have to have community partnerships. It is not something that is imposed by the police onto the community. There's a network of collaboration that exists within the community. There's an organizational transformation within the law enforcement department. It's just not a program that's tacked on. And that the main objective is that it's problem solving. You're looking at what are the underlying issues. And these collaborative relationships between law enforcement agencies and individual and organizations serve as a key to what we call the co-production of public safety. So what's that co-production? It means that there's a joint responsibility between the community and law enforcement to create public safety. So what are some examples of community policing? One that I'm very familiar with is the crisis intervention team model. And as Speaker Leonard talked about, the mental health issues within the community are very widespread. But when police officers don't have the training to interact with those individuals, then consequences occur that no one really wants to happen. And so the crisis intervention teams focus on 3 pillars. And again, some people think that crisis intervention teams are just police training. No, they're not just police training. The 3 pillars include an advisory board in the community that's the problem-solving mechanism where people go to discuss problems that include folks like the NAMI, like the community mental health providers, as well as law enforcement, the jail administrators, so that there's discussion and problem-solving going on. It also includes the 24-hour drop center. So this is so law enforcement actually have an alternative to dropping someone off at the jail because they don't want to sit in the emergency rooms for 8 hours and wait for someone to be processed. And they need to be back out on the street. So that's what a community intervention team should be, the model within a community policing framework. And I'm just going to tell you one quick story that we heard in St. Joe, which St. Joe is one of the governor's diversion pilot sites currently. And when we were talking to law enforcement officers there, one officer said that after going through the training, his whole practice was changed. And he said that before the training occurred, he had an altercation as they were arresting a gentleman. And it got physical. And when it got physical, this gentleman punched the officer. And so now he was charged with assaulting an officer, a 5-year charge. Is in jail. The officer goes through the 40-hour training and goes back to the judge after the training and said, I handled that situation all wrong. That man should not have been charged because my behavior escalated the situation rather than de-escalating the situation. So I think that gives us a really good example of what community policing can achieve. But what are the challenges? I think one of the big challenges is there are already some strained relationships between law enforcement and underserved communities. And so how do you establish trust? How do you create that trust when there's been a culture of mistrust within the community? The second is recruitment and retention. Are we recruiting officers that reflect the composition of the communities that are being served? And what are the barriers to getting law officers into those positions? One of the things, and I know Michigan is different than other states, that the training, the academy training, has to be paid for by the individual. And that can be a barrier to someone going through that training, where other states actually pay for that training so that it increases the flow of folks into the academy. The next is funding. I know we have a lot of backlash around the CIT training around the state because the model, the entire true model, the fidelity to the CIT model requires 40 hours of training. It's 40 hours of backfill that the department has to fund if someone's going to go through that training. That gets very expensive. And finally, the organizational policy doesn't match the culture. So sometimes we, get a program, looks good, we pull it off the shelf, and we put people through the paces of the program, but really the culture of the organization is not supportive of it. The culture hasn't changed. And so that training goes by the wayside because the organization hasn't really changed. All right, so now I'm going to turn it over to Amanda. Oh, I'm sorry.
So good morning. It's really good to be here with you all this morning. I'm excited to think deeply with you all in these roundtable sessions about these issues. I want to start off, before digging into poverty and confinement, I want to give us a charge this morning to really think boldly about our solutions. So the bar that I like to use is 5 generations from now, what will people thank us for? So I think that helps us think beyond just this legislative cycle or the 18-month grant cycle to think about what are really deeply transformative solutions, and then we can work our way back from there. So just putting that out there. So poverty and confinement. For a long time, I think people have realized that if you are poor, you get different access to justice in our system. You get a different shake. But I think what we're realizing more and more in recent years is that criminal justice system is actually a driver of poverty itself. And not just for people who are caught up in this cycle of a ticket becoming a failure to appear, becoming a warrant, becoming jail time in this cycle again and again, but for their families as well. To put a finer point on it, I want to tell you a couple stories from what we've been seeing in the front lines here in Detroit. So at the Detroit Justice Center, we launched a bail fund a few months ago. And so I want to get into our first issue here of the challenge of money bail and pretrial incarceration and its relationship with poverty. So we launched this bail fund, and many of you have probably followed this issue of money bail, in the news and changes happening around the country. And the reason that this is called mass incarceration's front door is because the way that if you are unable to pay your bond, this could be $300, $500, $600, you are sitting there pre-trial, convicted of nothing, as 60% of people in our jails are. So here in Wayne County, in the jail, folks aren't there because they have been charged and convicted of a crime and are sitting out their sentence. 60% of them are there pre-trial because they're too poor to bail out. And so what we have seen thus far in our bail fund are cases like one client who was sitting there for over a week because his family couldn't afford to pay $500 to bail him out. And in that time, he was missing his job, he was missing classes, and when we bailed him out and reunited with his family, he said that he had been trading his breakfast and lunch every morning so that he could use someone else's phone card to call home, because his family was too poor to put money on that phone card for him to call home. So that's the level of poverty that we are talking about. In another case, there was a father of 4, and as you should know that over half of people who are awaiting trial, they're waiting because they can't afford to bail out, they're parents of minor children. So this was a father of 4 who we bailed out because they could not afford a $400 bail. And over the course of that week that he was inside, he lost his job. But also, he was had been sharing caregiver responsibilities with his partner. And so after a few days of him being inside, she had to quit her job too, because who was going to stay home with these 4 kids? So you see, over the course of that week, because of $400, this family goes from 2 incomes to no income. And these children in our household with no income. And these are not outlier stories. This is happening again and again and again throughout the week. So this is the urgency, the scale of the poverty, and what the mass incarceration's front door looks like. The challenge with money bail is figuring out what comes next. So there are options on the table, and not all of them are progressive or would actually mean fundamental change. So one solution that's being touted is ankle monitors for people to be under surveillance when they come home. So what has happened is with some of our clients, once we bail them out, in one case we bailed out a 17-year-old boy because his family couldn't afford $500 to get him home, and he had to report right away to get an ankle monitor put on So the family couldn't afford for the bail, but this ankle monitor costs $200 to be installed, and then $100 a month to maintain that. So again, this is pre-trial. This child has been convicted of nothing, and yet this is the financial burden that his family is bearing. So our second challenge, and something that folks are starting to think more deeply about, is addressing the underlying funding structures that drive this in our courts. So some have called it cash register justice. So this practice of counties or governments using their poorest residents as a cash register to fund themselves. And we're seeing the ways in which this is deeply counterproductive to community well-being. But defendants are being charged for jail stays, for probation supervision, for these ankle monitors, for court fees, for the cost of a public defender. And so there's a commission that is trying to evaluate, starting in 2020, what more sustainable funding structures could look like, and that is deeply important work. Because these costs impact people long after a sentence is over. So if not paid, these are costs that remain on someone's credit history. It can be reported to credit bureaus. Wages can be garnished. So it's a real barrier to people moving on with their lives. So I hope I've driven home a bit the ways that criminal justice is exacerbating poverty. It's not just that poor people are swept up in it, but they're actually becoming poorer because of contact with the criminal justice system. So we would do well to divert people away at the front end, which brings us to alternatives to incarceration. So fortunately, we can point to many examples here in Michigan and around the country of alternatives in the here and now. And some that are in other states, but some that are right here at home. So incarceration places strain on families and neighborhoods. It exacerbates individual needs, so individual mental health issues, individual substance abuse, addiction issues. It leads to impacts on the economy. People who are, again, these folks who are bailing out, who are in the jail, those are employers who are needing to train new employees, and rehire. Has all sorts of job market implications. Studies have shown that incarceration has little to no relationship to declining crime rates, so it's not effective as a public safety solution. And it costs more than $1 trillion. So the number that is often cited is the $80 billion that the US spends on corrections every year. But a study came out a couple years ago from the University of Washington that found that the actual number, if you total up the impact on the economy, the cost on families, on other systems, on foster care systems that are strained, on homeless shelters, all these other things, it's $1.2 trillion. That's 6% of GDP. That is the cost of incarceration. And so we have invested very deeply in a faulty solution. And so our work now is to invest just as deeply in solutions. So I want to be clear that this is not going to be cost savings necessarily. This is going to be an expensive thing to not just shrink the budget, but actually undo the harms of incarceration and to restore communities. So there are many exciting initiatives underway. In Kansas City, but in other cities in South Carolina and elsewhere, they've opened up crisis centers, and Sheryl mentioned approaches along these lines as well. And these are places where people can go if they are in alcoholic distress, substance abuse distress, having a mental health crisis, rather than going to the ER or a jail cell. So imagine police officers not having to be first responders to mental health crises, but instead for there to be other places that divert people entirely. In North Carolina, there's an organization called Growing Change that is working in the poorest rural county in the state. So we need to keep thinking about the ways that this is an issue that connects urban and rural constituencies. So what Growing Change is doing, that's a prison town where the prison was shut down. And now what they're doing is flipping that former prison into a hydroponic farming station, to a community center for the community. So they're turning the guard tower, the surveillance tower, into a climbing wall for young people. They're diverting young people out of the criminal justice system into job training programs on this site. For job training programs in agriculture, hydroponic farming, all of these sustainable job prospects. And they want to partner in Michigan, just putting it on the radar. So we have to think about how to reimagine rural economies as well. Closer to home, the Hope Not Handcuffs program is working in several counties here in Michigan. Hopefully many of you are familiar with it. They're helping people who are facing addiction be able to be connected up with free substance abuse treatment and diverted away from arrest. In the issue brief that hopefully some of you have read, it highlights problem-solving courts as an alternative, and we heard about some of the mental health courts earlier. So I was at a problem-solving court a few years ago on the west side of the state, and there was a family that was caught up in a case there. So this was a case where two parents had had their home raided because it was a meth lab in the basement. And they were facing decades in prison because they also had guns in the home because they were hunters. And so these were going to be very long drug sentences with gun enhancements, and they also had children as well. And instead of imposing that sentence and having the kids go into foster care and be adopted off and essentially have this family broken up, this court decided to look at this situation and say, how do we make this right? What does this family need? And so what they got was individual addiction therapy for each of the parents, family therapy and counseling. They were connected to a dentist who helped them fix their teeth from the meth damage. They were connected with jobs and stable rehousing, and the family remained intact. So this is resource intensive, yes, but it is also far less expensive than decades in prison for these two parents, foster care placement, and the societal cost of this family disintegrating. We're also seeing really promising restorative justice work, even around cases of serious violence. So up to this point, a lot of the work has focused on, diverting, misdemeanor or lower level cases, stories of children who, graffiti on a shop window and how do they make it right with the shop owner, these kind of lower level cases, but which are important. But more and more, we're also seeing that restorative justice can be used in cases of very serious harm and felony cases. So, for example, the organization Common Justice in New York, which has made some site visits here and is building here in Michigan, what they have found, so they're one of the programs in the country that is actually able to divert violent felonies into restorative justice programming. And they have found that in over 90% of cases, if the prosecutor calls up the victim and says, do you want to try out this process, 90% of crime victims say, yes, I want to try that. And that's because it offers an option for actual answers and resolution about what happened in a way that our criminal justice system simply doesn't. So we're not doing right by crime survivors or victims of crime in our current system. So in order to recover from a traumatic incident, usually the most important thing in cases is to be able to tell yourself a coherent narrative about why this happened and why this all went down. And our criminal justice system doesn't allow for that to happen. It's all about suppressing evidence, about the defendant not speaking about what happened, about getting a verdict, but not actually the truth. And so restorative justice allows for that in a way that our courtrooms do not. So victims with restorative justice are able to get some answers and able to heal and move on. So we need more data. Again, back to this data collection issue. We need more data about the types of alternatives that are working. And then we have to invest very deeply in the solutions through justice reinvestment. Maryland and Colorado have very strong models for justice reinvestment. And as prisons start to close, which they are doing, and hopefully many more, we need to make sure that we're investing very deeply in reentry support services, in education programming, in restorative justice, and more. And the questions need to be, what can we invest in that gets at root causes? So we're starting to have more and more dialogues here in Detroit, but beyond, about what would make you feel safe. Because we've tried a lot of things for the last 30, 40 years, and they haven't been working. They've been making communities unstable, making them less safe. So there's a question that my colleague, Mariam Kaba in Chicago, likes to pose, and she says, can we imagine safe communities without aggressive policing and metal detectors and high incarceration rates and prisons? Can we imagine that? She says, yeah, it's called the suburbs. We have this. We have these places already that are safe and desirable, not because of all the metal detectors and aggressive policing, but because of things that actually make people safe, like great schools, like job opportunities, like functioning public services, intergenerational wealth. So let's find ways to invest in those things. I will turn it back to Sheryl to talk about reducing length of prison stays.
Thanks, ma'am. So in terms of reducing the length of prison stays, Around the country, we have seen more and more states motivated to change that tough-on-crime stance that increased sentencing lengths back in the 80s and 90s. And they're motivated by overcrowded prisons, very tight budgets, and also what they're seeing in terms of data-driven decision-making, that the length of the sentence does not equal deterrence. We found that in Michigan, that our sentences here in Michigan are 2 years longer than they were in 1998, and they're 50% longer than the national average. So Michigan has had a lot of success. I mean, we've gone from a high of 51,000 prisoners down to, I think it's 39,000 roughly. And so, but those who are in prison are staying longer. And we need to think about how do we reduce that length of stay. And we've got many challenges ahead. And I think that the tough-on-crime policies that have extended sentencing length, one of the things that the Criminal Justice Policy Commission is charged with is trying to figure out, do those sentencing strategies work? Have they been successful in keeping the public safer? And that's been a long road because of the data issues. We're starting to develop some data that's out there, but that's going to be a longer-term proposition to get the data on that. But we do know that the truth in sentencing that was eliminated in 1998 here in Michigan did have some pretty significant effects. Most other states provide good time credits to those who are in prison, and that means shorter lengths of stay. And when truth in sentencing came in, I'm going to give you an example of how it affected some effective programming in the state. So in the 90s, I worked with the Department of Corrections to create a program for pregnant women who were incarcerated, and Mary remembers that, she was there. And we took those women out of the prison system and transferred them into a community residential placement. And that meant that the cost of the medical care associated with that pregnancy were transferred to Medicaid because they were now in the community. It meant that the women were not separated from their infants at birth, and that they received programming and treatment for up to 1 year in the community. The women who were eligible for that program had sentences of 2 years or less when they came in. And before truth in sentencing was enacted, that meant they were eligible for community residential placement the day they walked in the prison. When truth in sentencing went into effect, what happened is they had to serve that 2-year minimum. And those babies just did not want to wait. Okay? So the program went away. The department then had the medical care of the women. Moms were separated from the babies. So it's an example of not only good time credits decreasing, but what are our options in terms of programming if we can use that time period to actually engage people in effective programming. The other thing is that the age of our prisoners in Michigan are much older than the average around the country. And with age, as I'm finding more and more, come health concerns, right? And so we spend in the state over $300 million a year within the Michigan Department of Corrections on health care costs. And I had a meeting with the MDOC medical director yesterday where they were talking about some of the access issues, like, for instance, not having a urologist available that can treat the prisoners, and they can't find other specialists to come into the facility, and that it's very expensive to transport others to those appointments. And so I think we need to think about that. And then I think the other thing is that when we're investing in longer sentences, what does it cost? The ACLU just came out with their study about smart justice, and they have a smart justice strategy for every state. And I'll give you one example of what they said. They said that if in Michigan we reduced the sentences for burglary from the average right now of 3.3 to 1.3 years, we could save the state $91.6 million. And I think that that's a very big number. I haven't looked about how they calculated that, but it's in their 2025 projections. But I think we need to think about how do we reinvest those dollars into other treatments, other programming that may make the criminal legal system more effective in keeping the public safe. Now I'm going to turn it back to Amanda. I'm sorry.
We're good. Okay, so finally, our final topic is removing post-incarceration barriers. We have some enormous opportunities when it comes to this, and it's really important that we work on removing these barriers because 95% of people in our prisons here in Michigan, they're coming home. So they're going to be reintegrated into our communities. And right now, we're not doing a great job of supporting returning citizens, and they still face just tremendous barriers to reintegrating and getting back on their feet and reestablishing themselves. So 60% of formerly incarcerated people are still unemployed a year after release. And you hear, if you talk to people, they will say things like, I applied for 40 jobs and was rejected 40 times. Or I did not have the choice not to be exploited. So I challenge us to think about what it means not just to tolerate people when they're coming back, but what would it mean to really put out a welcome mat for returning citizens back into our communities. So where does the recidivism rate stand now? And we've heard about some of the issues with how this is measured, how data is collected around this. But right now, by some measures, the recidivism rate is at a low of 28%. Which is a major improvement here in Michigan. But that still means that nearly 1 in 3 people released from Michigan prisons are returning within 3 years of release. Note in many cases, this is not because people are committing new crimes necessarily, but it's because they are caught up in this web of parole. Parole conditions and parole violations. In Michigan, as of a few years ago, probation and parole violators made up 44% of prison entries. So reentry work is critically important because a major reason that our prisons are so full is because something has failed. People have violated parole or gone back inside. So we have to keep in mind, with all the programs that we're thinking about, all the things that need to be more deeply invested in, our number one source of reentry support for people coming back from prison is families. So our national reentry program is family support. And yet families report having little to no support in reintegrating their loved one back into the household. In fact, they report losing their homes or facing eviction once they take in a loved one with a criminal conviction. So we need to keep in mind the work that mostly women, so sisters, loved ones, wives, grandmothers are doing in absorbing people coming back from prison and figure out ways to support those households directly. Michigan used to have a model that other states sought to replicate. Mary King knows this so well, but others in the room who were very involved in the Michigan Prisoner Reentry Initiative. And the hallmark of this program was the coordination that it allowed for between local and state government actors, between nonprofits and for-profit entities, various agencies. And Michigan saw the steepest reduction of a prison population in the shortest time frame of any state in the nation. It was proving very successful, and other states were coming to Michigan to learn how this was working. But unfortunately, funding was cut, and now it has become much more difficult for interagency collaboration with support. A few pressing issues and opportunities that I'll highlight as we close out. Expanding expungement eligibility. So there are clean slate programs up and running here in Detroit and elsewhere. And what we're finding is a lot of people show up very excited that they're going to get their criminal record expunged and they can finally get that job that they have been wanting and are deeply qualified for. And they find out that actually they do not meet the very narrow eligibility requirements to expunge their criminal record. And so there are some legislative bills that are looking to expand that, but that is something that is incredibly necessary. At the Detroit Justice Center, we are partnering with MDOC, we're very excited about this, to pilot in-reach reentry legal services. So providing legal support to people in the weeks and months before release to be able to figure out what is the benefit of addressing some of these legal barriers before people get out. Because there are these incredible programs once people get out. So there, more and more, there are job placement, job training programs. And what you find is people can't always complete them because of some kind of legal barrier. So maybe they were like the average man here in Michigan and came out with $26,000 in child support debt because they did not modify their child support order when they went in. Well, attorneys, we can file some paperwork to get the state-owed part of that discharged, to get the order reduced, and so we can set them up on a path where they won't be afraid to open a bank account to deposit their earnings because they won't be worried about wage garnishment or bank account garnishment. So just these simple tweaks. It's often about getting the right paperwork in order, making sure that people have the correct ID, making sure we're pulling their credit history and seeing if there was a repossession or an old bill that they forgot about before they went inside that would be a barrier to their opportunities to take out a loan or to rent housing when they get back out. So we're going to see what it looks like to reach people before they get out, and we'll tell you after this pilot is done how it goes. So in our conversations today, I want to remind us to think big, and more than anything, to have the solutions going forward today and going forward have them led by directly impacted people. Nothing has shaped my own perspective about what is needed more than the experiences of our clients and people going through this who live it every day. So they will tell you exactly where these well-crafted policies are breaking down in practice. And often the small gaps or the small fixes that need to be made that can make an enormous difference in people's lives, and that only comes through deep listening to people experiencing these situations. So one example of this kind of solution that seems small but is huge, the Center for Employment Opportunities, CEO, which is based out of New York but recently opened here in Detroit, they're a leading program when it comes to job placement and supportive services for people coming back from prison. And part of what makes their program so groundbreaking and the results so good is that they pay people at the end of each day rather than having them wait 2 weeks for their paycheck. And it was this kind of tweak that they, in listening to people who were saying how hard it was to have to wait another week before their money to come in. So that small type, of change can make an enormous difference for people who are living with this. So let's keep the long-range, bold solution vision in mind, but also listen well to what could make life a whole lot easier for people in the here and now, and design solutions accordingly, led by that wisdom and expertise. So thank you. Looking forward to the conversations.
Thank you, Sheryl and Amanda, for that overview. So now our work begins. We are going to move into the small group sessions, and we have engaged Mary King, who's the Executive Director of the Michigan Council on Crime and Delinquency, to be our, in fact, chief facilitator of this day, and of course also to help put this convening together. So I'm going to ask Mary to come up and explain what we are planning to do. Thanks, Mary.
Good morning. Thank you for coming out this morning. First of all, I'd like to start by just asking for another round of applause for our fantastic presenters. They really gave us a great jumping off point for the next part of our work today. But I also, before I get into that, I wanted to just mention that we in this room today have members of a group called Nation Outside, the voice of formerly incarcerated people, a group of men and women, and I'd like them to stand up if they'd like to. We've got Josh and Alan, Kevin. This is a group of men and women who are formerly incarcerated who have joined together to create a unified voice. And they're working to engage other formerly incarcerated people civically, not just in voting, but also in asking to have a seat at the table when things that directly impact their lives are being discussed. And so I encourage you all to come and become members of Nation Outside. It's free membership and also help support that voice. So now it is time to get to work. I believe this was mentioned, but unlike a lot of conferences where people come and hear presentations and then go home, this is a roundtable. We actually invited you here because our agenda is for everybody to get to work today. And this is how that's going to happen. So you were assigned a small group based on your preferences, and that should be listed in your packet. In addition, we also have the rooms where you'll be going. So I want to tell you a little bit about where the rooms are located. If you are in the Alternatives to Incarceration group, you're going to be in the Windsor room. You have to take the escalator all the way down to the first floor, and at the bottom of the escalator, turn left through the glass doors, and you'll see the sign to get you to your room. The community policing folks are going to be in the Crystal Ballroom, which is on this floor right down the hall. The data collection, poverty and confinement, and removing post-incarceration barriers are all on the third floor, and your rooms are marked. And then folks who are in the length of stay group are going to stay in this room. We'll put some tables together. Yesterday we had 2 groups in one of the larger rooms, and it was just too noisy to do that. So that's why we're doing the last minute change. So I also want to remind you a little bit about the work that you're going to be doing in those small groups. We have a facilitator lined up to lead the discussion on one of each of the 6 issue areas. And the goal is to find and identify what are the common challenges, what is the work that's currently underway. You'll notice that in the draft briefs that you were given in advance and that we also have in your packet today, you have the whole list of briefs, that we listed what we knew about what was underway in Michigan, but we also know that it's a very incomplete list. And we're looking for your expertise to help fill that list in. But then the bulk of the work that you're going to be doing is around developing solutions to address the challenges that were called out in that draft. Because we want people to be bold, but we also want people to be specific. So when you're thinking about how to address those challenges, be thinking about what could actually be accomplished in Michigan over the next 2 years, and who needs to take leadership for that to happen? And what would that look like if that were actually going to be implemented? If you're interested in more than one issue, we made you choose one group, but if you're interested in more than one issue, that's fantastic, because you're going to have an opportunity to weigh in on all of the issues. When the small groups are done and after we have our lunch and our keynote speaker, we're all going to be back in this room. We'll have a report out from each of the small groups, and then we'll facilitate a discussion with everyone in the room so that you can provide feedback. Because at the end of the day, what we want to do is create a document that can be used as a blueprint, and it's a document that's been vetted by all of the people in this room. So I would like to ask the facilitators and the note takers to meet briefly with me at the front of the room. If you are one of the participants, I'm going to dismiss you to go to your room and ask that we start promptly at 10:30. Thank you very much.